This is my review of the game Vampyr, and yes, I say vampire. I don't say vampire or vampire or vampyr or however else you want to say it. I say vampire rhymes with tire, pyre, hire, not vampire rhymes with deer, peer, or over here, okay? I don't care how they say it in Russia, I don't care how they say it in Poland, I don't even care how they say it in Transylvania. I'm English, I say vampire, so I'm doing a review of the game Vampyr. If that bothers you, prepare to be bothered, because that's what I'm gonna do. Vampyr. I'm reviewing the game Vampyr. Okay? Excellent. On Steam, Vampyr is flagged as a vampire RPG where choices matter, there's a vague horror feel, and apparently there is some action, although, to be honest with you, there's not an awful lot of action. This game is heavy on the dialogue. If some games could be accused of being walking simulators, this game could absolutely be accused of being a gossip simulator. You are going to be talking a lot. In fact, if I were to estimate 90% of the game is talking, it's probably not that far off. If you don't like dialogue, if you are looking for a vampire action game, this is almost certainly not for you. If you're looking for a vampire RPG, it might be for you. If you're looking for a vampire RPG where you talk all the time to everyone and find out their life story in great detail, this is definitely for you. The game is set in London at the end of the First World War, and it really does have that old-fashioned vampire story vibe to it. The setting is perfect. I mean, there's something about London at that period that just suits this kind of game. And the protagonist is one Dr. Jonathan Reed, who is a newborn vampire in the sort of almost stereotypical style. He's a British gentleman, educated, cool, reasonably good looking, wears the cool long coat and looks somehow menacing and yet slightly comforting at the same time. He is also conveniently one of the world's experts in the subject of blood.
This must be the place. It's definitely away from prying eyes. Relegated to the shadows. A kingdom of my own. At least I won't be sleeping in a coffin.
Obviously, as a vampire, his obsession with blood has actually increased, but for very different reasons, and he is now trying to figure out who made him and why. Vampyr is an RPG and does have a character build system that will let you take certain abilities and powers and improve upon them. So you're going to be able to get better at shooting with guns, do more damage with melee weapons, and you'll even get powers that let you do shadow damage, blood damage, certain powers that will help you defend or even heal yourself. What makes Vampyr interesting is the way you earn experience to advance your character to become more powerful. You can, of course, do quests and fight the enemies, the monsters and the various vampire hunters that want you dead, but the amount of experience you get for those things is pretty small, especially the fighting aspect of it. You don't get much experience at all. The way to get the most experience is to actually embrace the civilians that you find in London. And embrace is a nice way of saying rip out their throats and drink their blood. Yes, if you want to become more powerful, you are probably going to have to snack on the citizenry. However, before you run off and depopulate the entirety of London, you do need to understand there is a price to pay. There is a catch to embracing the citizens. Well, there's actually two catches. The first catch or complication is the fact that you get a lot more experience for embracing a citizen if you know their story, if you understand them, if you've got hints about the secrets they keep. And so, if you don't want to waste experience, you're encouraged to run around, search for clues, perhaps do quests, talk to people, and get to know them. This, of course, does make it somewhat more difficult to just murder people. It's a little harder to murder someone you've got to know, especially if in the process of this you've helped them out, you've done some quests, you've sorted their life out, perhaps you've turned them around from the brink and given them hope of a better life, and now you're thinking about ending that life just to become a little more powerful. The second problem with the murder everybody approach is the fact that this game has consequences. When you do something, the game will generally react to it. That includes some of the conversations as well. Some of the conversation options you have will make a difference. You may choose an option in the dialogue that will give you a new hint or will completely close down any further investigations. It will have an effect. But obviously killing someone has a fairly major effect on the area around and those that are close to them. You can actually find if you kill someone, some of the people that knew them will actually change location, change habits, they will change the way they act, the things they say. But you will also find that the district they live in suffers a hit to its health. They call it district health. It's essentially how well balanced the area is with regards to the citizens and the diseases that are rampant there. If the district becomes too unhealthy, it can become more and more hostile until it actually completely collapses. And at that point, whenever you enter that district, you'll be fighting your way through the entire time, and indeed you will probably lose all of the citizens, all of the people that were left. So A, you won't be able to complete quests for them, but B, you won't actually be able to embrace them. So you've got a bit of a balancing act to make. And the game does give you the incentive to consider this balancing act, because whilst you don't want to make life more difficult for yourself by reducing the district's health, and you don't want to end certain quests, you will find the game gets tougher and tougher if you refuse to embrace anyone. If you want to play the vampire that does not kill, or at least does not kill the innocent, the non-hostiles, you are going to find things get tough. It is possible you can get to the end of this game and take no lives outside of the people who are directly hostile against you, and it's not actually what I would call difficult, but it does require focus, and some of the fights will take time, but the game does incentivize, well, taking a few lives to make life a bit easier. One of the things you'll find in this game is if you meet enemies that are 5, 6, 7 levels higher than you, they will do a lot of damage to you and you will do very little to them. The enemy scaling is sort of punishing, or at least it feels that way to me. So even if you spend your experience in powers that don't directly help you in a fight, the fact that you have gained levels when taking those powers will actually make the fight easier, because you will hit harder and people will hit you with less severity. So this is something that will affect you. You can, of course, choose to go the full psychopath, kill everything sort of vampire and become incredibly powerful. Insanely powerful, actually. You will breeze through pretty much every fight and you'll find yourself just toying with your victims like a cat toying with an injured bird. It becomes trivially easy for pretty much the entire game after a certain point. You just become so powerful. Of course, the districts will look pretty bad by the time you've finished, but if you're playing that sort of a vampire, what do you care? However, be warned, you will need to do it sensibly, cleverly. You can't just rush off and kill everyone instantly because the districts will just collapse too quickly. You need to bide your time and pick people off at the right time and choose when you're done with a district. Once you get to a point where you think, I have nothing left to gain from this district, perhaps then you can go wild. And in the end, that is what makes this game so enjoyable. You are encouraged to dig very deep into the histories and stories behind all of the characters. You have to consider what you are going to do, what you're going to say, and of course, who you are going to kill. It will affect things around you, and I'm going to tell you, this is not a spoiler alert, it will affect the outcome of the game. It's going to be something that you have to live with throughout your entire playthrough. Your actions have consequences. To be honest, that's why you would play a game like this. This is the sort of game that will appeal to people who like old-style adventure games. Games where you need to investigate lots of different things, where you're encouraged to have conversations with a lot of people. It's more like a detective game than anything else. You're just trying to figure out what makes everyone tick, just in case you want to dismantle them, but also partly because you're probably curious. A big part of this game is being completely nosy, wanting to know absolutely everything about everyone. And there are a variety of ways you can go about doing that, from talking to them, that's probably the primary, to rifling through their furniture to see if they've left notes behind, or occasionally observing them having some conversation or doing something a little illicit. There are plenty of ways to do this, but you're going to become a detective and a sort of judge and executioner all at the same time. You're going to be constantly trying to get to the bottom of every single solitary mystery and then deciding what to do with those people. Now, this game definitely has a lot going for it, and I did enjoy it, and I can highly recommend it to anybody who likes story-driven games and enjoys dialogue. But there are a few weaknesses that I should mention. They are things that will affect you if you find those sort of things important. There are 3 things I want to mention. The first and probably most obvious problem with this game is the combat. It's a little clumsy. It doesn't have that fluid feeling you would expect in a game such as this. I mean, it's a fairly standard, over-the-shoulder, third-person action game, but there are lots of little things that I just found annoying. The aiming system, for example. It wasn't always easy to know where I was going to aim. It doesn't seem to aim where I'm looking with the mouse, but where the character is aiming, although not always there either. The only surefire way to know where you're aiming is to use the lock-on mechanic, which is something that I generally don't like using in these games, but for this one it was pretty much essential. However, it's not very well done, and sometimes it was more trouble than it was worth. It got me killed a couple of times because it has a strange mechanic to change target based upon how you move the mouse, which is totally weird for me. Perhaps this is something that works better on a controller, but I found my instinctive mouse movements when in combat would cause all sorts of problems. And so in the end, I had to learn to lock on for a target that I was going to shoot with a weapon or a targeted power, and then lock off quickly, especially if I was facing multiple opponents, because if you're facing multiple opponents, it gets very messy. It can become a little unpredictable on how you're going to move. It also makes avoiding AoE attacks extremely difficult. Whenever an AoE was getting fired, I was dropping the lock so that I had far more freedom in my moving. It's not the end of the world, and it's not difficult exactly. The combat becomes manageable once you get the hang of the basics, but it never feels good. It's not the sort of game I would play because I really enjoyed the combat. It's not challenging, it's just kind of frustrating. Like you're fighting the mechanics not the opponents. Kind of difficult to explain. It's just not a strong point for this game, at least not for me using a mouse and keyboard. The second flaw was a little simpler to describe, and it's the fact that the camera during the dialogue would be in strange places occasionally. It wasn't every time, but sometimes you'd start a conversation and you'd end up staring at Dr. Reed's left ear, and that was it. That was for the entire conversation. It was a little strange. Now, I am told that you can adjust the camera if you're using a controller, but I didn't know you could actually do that. I didn't get any on-screen prompts, and nothing I did in-game with a mouse or keyboard seemed to alter the camera, so I don't think you can. I know some people have suggested they played with mouse and keyboard and had controller on the side just for the camera in dialogue, which is, you know, it's not brilliant. And finally, the third problem, which is probably the least important, and yet it's the one that annoyed me the most, and that's the fact that the key rebind system really did not work very well at all. I couldn't rebind all of the keys from within the game and had to actually exit and edit a config file with an editor, and even then the results were inconsistent, with some key rebinds just refusing to work. I would have to open a menu that wasn't the one I wanted and then tab across to get to it. And there were some keys that just refused to rebind and made me actually feel like they were hard-coded. I think what annoys me the most about this sort of a problem is how unnecessary it is. Getting this sort of thing right is actually pretty easy. It's not technically difficult, it requires good coding standards and reasonable design. So this one it annoys me because it really should not happen. Overall, when taken together, these three flaws make me feel like the mouse and keyboard interface was added later on. They didn't give it any thought and then tried to sort of tag it on, fix it on with duct tape. It really doesn't feel well thought out. It doesn't feel like it had a lot of input from someone who plays with mouse and keyboard a lot. And it doesn't feel like they play tested with mouse and keyboard, to be honest, because some of these flaws are very easy to fix and really obvious. Taking all that into account, the big question now, of course, is did that ruin the game for me? And the simple answer is no, it really didn't. It was marginally annoying at times. It's the sort of thing that I did notice, but it didn't take away from the main focus of the game, which was the story and the dialogue. This game really is not about the combat. It isn't. So the fact that the combat felt sluggish and clumsy didn't really change my opinion that much at all. In fact, probably the camera angle would have had more effect, but even then it didn't, because of course I could still hear the conversations. So I still picked up the story, I still picked up the dialogue, and honestly, I thoroughly enjoyed that side of this game. It wasn't the greatest story I'd ever seen. It was a solid story that was well told, although sometimes a little confusing. The dialogue was not the best dialogue I've ever seen, but it was pretty good. The voice acting it varied. It was pretty good and excellent in places. And the atmosphere was good. Generally it worked. The music was very good. I enjoyed that side of things. And all round, the feeling of having consequences just really worked. But when taken together, you know, when you bundle it all together and play it as a game, it wasn't just okay or good. It just worked really well for me. I thoroughly enjoyed playing this game from beginning to end. Even with the frustrating moments in combat, I just really did enjoy the feeling of being a detective. I guess I'm naturally a nosy person, prying into everyone's business, but I loved that aspect of it. I loved the feeling that saying the wrong thing would get me into trouble. I loved the fact that when I did something, when I killed one of the citizens, things changed. I really got a kick out of this feeling that I was having an impact on the game. And I think more than anything, I just enjoyed playing a game for once that was not afraid to have dialogue, to have a lot of dialogue, to not constantly feel the need to throw action at you in case you got bored. It wasn't like, okay, you've had a 2-minute conversation, I best throw 20 melee fights at you or something. This is the sort of game where you might talk to people for 2 to 3 hours without having a single fight. You probably will have 1 or 2 in between as you're travelling, but sometimes not. There were entire cutscenes that would last quite a long time, and then you would start a conversation immediately afterwards, and suddenly an hour's gone and you've barely moved. This game was not afraid to do that and did not suffer for doing it. It didn't treat the player like they had goldfish levels of attention. My final verdict for this game would be I really did enjoy it, and I would love to play a sequel or another game by this developer that has the same ideas. Hopefully it'll be a little more polished. Hopefully the mouse and keyboard interface will be better implemented. But honestly, even if it wasn't, even with its current flaws, I would play Vampyr 2 without any hesitation. I really did enjoy this game, so it gets a big thumbs up from me.